Hello and welcome to the module on writing cogent essays. In this module we're going to be talking a bit about the writing process. Some areas we will cover are outlines, parts of an essay, including the introduction, the essay body, and conclusion, supporting reasons, areas to watch out for, and hints on editing. Since this module is about writing, there are not any dynamic videos to link to. This is essentially going to be all lecture, but hopefully you will find some useful information within. The writing process. The book says that experienced writers tend to keep their basic goals firmly in mind as they write, and indeed as they prepare to write. This is true when writing something specifically for an audience. One thing I would like to add to this, however, is that oftentimes writing is also a method of thinking. Sometimes the goal of writing is to clarify one's own thoughts, or to clarify one's understanding of some other material, such as with the note-taking methods discussed in the last module. In such cases, there isn't always a hard and flexible goal in mind. Another thing I would like to add is that one does not want to be so set upon one's goals for writing that one is unwilling to change them if those goals do not seem to be working. One learns as one writes a piece. One's thinking becomes clearer, one gains new information and evidence, and one has an opportunity to think about how the elements of an overall thesis tend to fit together. Given this, one might often shift gears while writing a piece. When writing my dissertation, for example, I constructed an entire chapter that I later decided had to be thrown out. Once I had finished writing most of it, it became clear that it wouldn't work correctly with the rest of the piece. So the authors are right, with the two caveats that sometimes one writes in order to clarify one's own thoughts, and that one should not be so goal-oriented while writing that one is afraid to change direction when something isn't working. That said, you should develop a plan for the piece you are writing. Of tremendous use is an outline. When I was in high school, I used to laugh at the idea of having to make outlines for writing. This was largely because the pieces we were writing were so simple. They didn't really need to be outlined. The outline seemed to actually get in the way of getting the work done. But when writing a more complex piece, outlines can be extremely valuable. One real advantage of an outline is that it lets you write a paper out of order, much like the directors of movies shoot scenes out of order. If you feel stuck on one section, you can move on to another. Quite often, for example, the introductory section of a piece is the part that I write at the very end. Usually I put in just a placeholder paragraph that roughly introduces the idea that I know I will replace later. Then I move on to the areas of the piece I know I will need to include. Then, once I see what the entire piece looks like, I can go back and give an introduction that takes into account what I have actually written, instead of just what I anticipate that I will write. Here's an example of an outline for Chapter 2 of my doctoral dissertation. Obviously, this is going to be much more complex than anything for a short essay. I am using it as an example because 1, it's something I actually made use of, and 2, so you can see one that's actually been put to practical use. You should note that each individual heading is quite often going to be represented by more than one paragraph. Indeed, sometimes if arguments in a particular section are complex enough, you might want to outline them in more detail someplace else. For really big projects, you might have several levels of outlines. For my dissertation, for example, I had a project-level outline where I listed the chapters, estimated length, and what was to be accomplished in each of them. I didn't break down the chapter into detail like I do here. It was an overall project outline. An outline provides a guideline for the basic structure of the piece, but you're not a foreman who has to follow somebody else's blueprint exactly. If you learn something while you are writing and the outline doesn't work for you anymore, then you might need to add, remove, change, or otherwise alter something in your outline. As mentioned, one of the nice things about an outline is that it lets you write things out of order. When you first create your document, create a heading for each element of your outline. You can then jump from one element to the next as you have ideas for each bit. Sometimes you may keep these sections separated by headings in your final draft. Other times, you may get rid of the headings and replace them with transitional sentences or transitional paragraphs. Either way, it's incredibly useful to be able to add to different parts of your piece as you have ideas for them without trying to keep it all in your mind until you get there. If you are on a roll in one section and don't want to get derailed, but you have an idea for another section, you can just jump to it Add a bullet point or note to yourself, then jump back. So I'd just like to reiterate some of that with bullet points. An outline provides a basic guideline for the structure of the piece. Each individual heading might be represented by more than one paragraph. An outline lets you write things out of order. Put the sections of your outline down on the page. You may later keep section headings or replace them with transitions. These headings provide you with convenient places to jump to as you get ideas. As the book points out, writing is not a linear process, and experienced writers do spend more time on editing. The authors point out how lots of times experienced authors will interrupt themselves for a while to find just the right word. This can be good, but you don't want to derail yourself too much. Finding just the right word is important, but with modern word processors, you don't have to write things perfectly the first time. If I know there is a word out there for what I want to say, but my mind is freezing on it, I often just leave a blank space or a placeholder in red or some other coloring to tell me to fix it on my rewrite or redraft later. For example, suppose I'm saying something like, marriage is a big decision in one's life, and I'm not happy with the word big. I might do this. Marriage is a blank decision in one's life. Or I might put marriage is a big decision in one's life with big in red. And then on a rewrite, I will come up with just the right word and change it to marriage is a momentous life decision. This is a relatively simple example, but it can be useful if you are struggling to come up with an example to illustrate your point. Suppose you want to explain some complex idea and you're currently struggling for an analogy. You could just put in, insert analogy here, and move on with your writing and then get back to it later. So as long as you think you'll be able to come up with such an example, you can put in a placeholder and come back to it later. This isn't to say that you shouldn't ever pause for significant amounts of time to get things just right. As I mentioned, writing helps clarify your thoughts. One reason to pause and think before moving on is to clarify your own reasoning so that what you write will later make sense. But it's also important to get your thoughts on the page. The key to good writing is good editing. Edit, edit, edit. You should never turn in a first draft of a paper or even a second, not in college. The outline also helps you stay focused and on point. It's easy to drift off into tangents when writing. Having a roadmap of where you're going, even if you change it at some point, helps you keep on track. The more complex the project, the more important such a roadmap is. You might not need one for an email or a short forum post, but they are invaluable when writing an essay. Okay, parts of an essay. There are three major parts of an essay: the introduction, the essay body, and the conclusion. The introduction. As I said, I often write this last once I know where the piece is going to end up. You want something that's going to get the reader's attention and lay out precisely what it is you plan on doing. You don't want the reader to be wondering why it is you're talking about what it is you're talking about at any given time. Even in these short PowerPoint lectures, I have an introduction to tell you what the topic is and about the subtopics we're going to be covering. In addition, the tone of the piece usually begins to come through in the introductory section as well. Now, often students are taught the 5-paragraph essay. This isn't necessarily something you should take into college. It's a good starting point in the same way that Legos are a good way to learn about building things. The standard model, though, isn't going to work for every or even most assignments in a real college course. I mention this here because sometimes you'll find that an introduction needs to be more than 1 paragraph long. It depends upon what kind of background you need to bring in. For book-length projects, introductions are commonly an entire chapter. Essay body. Here's where you offer evidence, support, examples, and so forth. It's called the body of the essay because it's the larger and primary piece of your essay. Think about what kind of support you need to give. Keep in mind your audience. What are you trying to accomplish with the piece? Are you trying to persuade? Are you trying to demonstrate to the instructor the thoroughness of your understanding? When writing essays to an instructor, you don't want to skip explaining everything your audience understands, since part of the reason for the assignment in the course is usually not just to provide information yourself, but also to demonstrate your own understanding of the material. Often a good rule of thumb is to write as if writing to a peer who isn't taking the course. Are you merely trying to investigate a topic and raise questions? What can you assume your audience knows? If you're a physicist writing to other physicists, you don't need to explain basic physics. In fact, it would be insulting if you did. If you're a physicist writing to a lay audience, however, if you skip basic explanations, you'll lose your audience and they won't be able to follow what you're saying. How is your audience likely to feel about your thesis? Are they friendly, skeptical, mixed? Who are you addressing? What is the best time to take with them? What is your strategy for connecting with them? Win them over with humor? An objective scholarly tone? A meticulous and detailed examination that anticipates their objections? What are your space restraints? How focused do you need to be? In short, try to put yourself in your reader's shoes. What will he or she be thinking when reading your piece? What assumptions might the reader be making that you need to correct? What background knowledge might the reader be bringing into the piece that you can count on? What terms do you need to define? Are you using terms in a specialized way? The better you can become at evaluating your own work through the eyes of your audience, the better your pieces will become. The conclusion. Your conclusion should restate the thesis, as the book said. This is true, but it shouldn't just repeat exactly what you said before. Think about what you would want as a reader. You yourself wouldn't want to essentially read the same paragraph multiple times in a piece. By restate the thesis, what is meant is that you recap the important parts of the arguments. The longer and more complex your piece, the more recapping you have to do. So consider how complex your piece is. For very short pieces, you can likely sum up with a conclusion that ties together all your points. For longer and more complex pieces, you want to hit bullet points of your thesis and remind your reader of how you got from point A to point B, or perhaps to points C and D. The length and depth of your conclusion is going to depend on several things. A good rule of thumb is this: if the reader reads your conclusion, she should be able to get a pretty good idea argued for in your piece, even though she will not know all the details or support for your position. Some other considerations. Are there unanswered questions you want to draw the reader's attention to? Are there issues that go beyond the scope of your paper, but which might be sources of fruitful investigation in the future which you would like to point out? What is the final thought you would like to leave your reader with? And again, remember that the conclusion can be more than one paragraph. Once again, many book-length projects have an entire chapter that sums up the material. So, again, don't be set into the whole 5-paragraph essay mindset. When giving supporting reasons, you want concrete evidence. Be specific. Avoid weasel words. The book mentions personal experience as a good source of evidence, but remember the many ways in which personal experience is a weak form of evidence from the last module. That isn't to say that one should never use it, but when you use personal experience, make sure that you are using it to prove something that personal experience can prove. The same thing goes for using the experiences of others. Authorities can be very important. The fact that there exists an appeal to authority fallacy is not a reason not to appeal to authorities. It's just a reason to make sure that your authority is appropriate. We cannot all be experts in everything. We have to rely on authorities. The key is finding good ones. Look for authorities from peer-reviewed journals and with good reputations in their fields. Look for authorities that are speaking as an authority for their particular field. Look for authorities that are not going beyond what an authority can say about the issue at that particular moment. For example, are equally qualified experts evenly divided on the issue? If so, an authority might only show that a particular option or interpretation is currently reasonable, not that it's correct. And always cite authorities. If you do not do this in college, you can get into lots of trouble. Colleges take this more and more seriously every year, it seems. Use quotes. Cite the author within the text using parentheses or footnotes, depending on the style guide you're using, and provide a reference list at the end. Some things to watch out for. When you're writing academic nonfiction, be careful of using too much metaphor. Metaphor can be mistaken for an argument from analogy. It is not that one should never do this, but remember that with nonfiction, your primary goal is to communicate and persuade. Metaphors are, by their very nature, non-literal comparisons. The author's meaning when using them, therefore, can easily be vague or even opaque to the reader. The same thing is true when arguing ironically or sarcastically. If one is going to do this, one wants to make sure that it is clear that one is doing so. Often it isn't a good idea in academic papers, though it can be, as discussed last time, very useful in other situations. Edit, re-edit, and re-edit again. Writing isn't a one-pass process. It involves writing, rewriting, and rewriting again and again and again. This cannot be stressed enough. Writing is a process. Some editing hints. Set aside your paper for a few hours before your first edit. Come at it with fresh eyes. It's all too easy to see what you meant to write rather than what you actually did write when rereading your piece. Have somebody else read your piece to see what they had difficulty understanding. There's no substitution for a sample reaction of how your audience might respond. Do not be afraid to cut out material. The process of editing is, to a great extent, a process of making your writing shorter and more precise. Far from hesitating to cut out material, you should be actively looking for thoughts that are repeated, ideas that could be stated more precisely, and tangents that could be cut. If you think of writing as only putting material down on the page, you fall into the trap of feeling like you are undoing work or making negative progress whenever you delete something. Nothing could be further from the truth, however. Editing is part of writing. When you make your writing more precise, when you delete unnecessary material, when you eliminate tangents or bad arguments, this is all part of writing, and it is all part of making your piece better. By being given so many assignments with minimum word counts in grammar school, unfortunately, students are trained to think that the goal is to get a particular number of words on the page. But that is not the goal of writing. The goal is to communicate an idea well. Removing unnecessary text and condensing and consolidating what is left is positive progress. Word counts tend to be necessary in high school so that those students who don't wish to write have a concrete goal to reach and know when they will be finished. In college, students are slowly weaned off them by being given guidelines that are designed to more let students know the level of detail that is expected in the piece than to let them know when they are finished. In graduate school, word counts are often given as maximums because students will tend to write too much detail. I had a couple of teachers in graduate school who would say, "I'm going to stop reading at page X." And then the question would often be, how small of a font are we allowed to use? So the attitude about how to approach writing tends to change as you write more and more. But think about how you approach writing when you write a letter or email to a friend, or if you keep a blog or web page. How you update that. You likely don't set a word count for yourself ahead of time. Instead, you have something you want to communicate, and you are done when you have said enough to communicate that idea to your satisfaction. Nor was it a waste of time to have put down the text that you cut in the first place. As I have mentioned before, writing is largely about thinking on the page. Oftentimes the material you cut out was necessary to write to get you to the point that you're at now. Once you reach a higher level of understanding, you can cut it out, but that doesn't mean it's wasted. Builders have to build all sorts of scaffolding in order to erect a building. The fact that they have to tear down that scaffolding afterwards doesn't mean that the building of it was a waste of time in the first place. Without it, the building could never have been completed. The scaffolding was needed to be erected, and it needed to be torn down to produce the finest building possible. Another hint: to find grammatical errors, read your paper backwards, last sentence first. To find structural errors in paragraphs, read it backwards, last paragraph first. This helps disassociate you from what you expect to see and put you in touch with what is actually on the page. It's a nice little trick for catching errors. Okay, that ends this presentation. I just want to conclude with a few summary remarks. Writing is a skill that will become increasingly important in your college careers. If you plan to go to a 4-year college or graduate school, it will continue to grow in importance. If you are looking for a career that requires you to think and communicate your ideas to others, writing is not something that will end with your school career. Two of the most common complaints of employers is that they have employees that cannot, 1, critically think, and 2, write well. These skills are linked, and philosophy is well situated to help you improve both of them, but it can't do it in the abstract. Like with any learned skill, you can be taught the techniques abstractly, but your abilities can only be sharpened by practice. Writing is a complex topic. We were only able to touch upon some of the most pressing issues here. Nevertheless, I hope you found some of these hints useful to you. Please take this module's forum assignment seriously. It will both help you get a jump start on the essay and allow you to get feedback on your thought process from other students. I deliberately tied this assignment in with the essay to effectively give you more time to dedicate to writing one well-polished piece. Until next time.